Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here in the reopened building. And as Elise mentioned, we'll be discussing today our project, the Empire Mint Shop, which we've been working on since 2013 and just recently published a book about it. Timber from Burma,
lamb from New Zealand,
fruit from Cyprus,
fish from Nigeria,
sugar from Mauritius,
cotton from Uganda.
Jungles today are the gold mines tomorrow.
For the sake of proteins, carbs, vitamins, minerals, or fibers, posters produced by the Empire Marketing Board of Great Britain encouraged British citizens to consume foodstuffs from the colonies and overseas territories. Stressing the transoceanic supply chain, they equated product to provenance by imposing matter on places and places on matter. So bananas were to Jamaica as much as Jamaica to bananas.
The Empire Marketing Board constructed a highly sophisticated imaginary using landscapes and architectures to promote protectionist forms of shopping for both items and origins between 1926 and 1933.
Using intensive visual propaganda to remind citizens that empire buyers are empire builders, the British government aimed to increase the flow of goods and money within the territory of empire through the marketing of foodstuffs cultivated across its colonies and dominions. And within this national project, the planet in a way became the supermarket for consumers who took availability of produce as a given.
The circulation of exotic items introduced new stimulating substances for the bourgeoisie and industrial workers alike. Beyond enhancing palatable pleasure, the speed of bodies was profoundly altered as they became exposed and then accustomed to caffeine, nicotine, cocaine, tea, cocoa, and sugar. Labor productivity, and then in turn labor exploitation, increased in factories thanks to improved stamina that rendered the human body simultaneously dependent on energizing and relaxing substances.
And here, for instance, you can see in one of these posters the different territories from these posters from the 1920s and what each territory was supposed to be kind of exporting or importing. So, for instance, Bermuda was potatoes and lily bulbs, or St. Kitts and Nevis, sugar, cotton, etc., etc. As familiar as these imports became, most citizens could neither experience in the flesh nor even imagine the production sites of those same foodstuffs. Visual propaganda in the form of posters, films, and also recipes enhanced a geographical gap between two realities. On the one hand, a relative proximity to a site of tropical foodstuffs, but on the other, a relative distance from the abusive labor conditions and very violent labor conditions of their production. Indeed, the planet became or was transformed into a highway connecting and dividing sites of production from sites of consumption.
At the same time, colonies were depicted as sites where inhabitants and wilderness had to be tamed, while the more civilized dominions were organized by a geometric order. And here you can see on your left a poster titled Sugar in Barbados, and on your right oranges in South Africa, where in Barbados we see this kind of wild sugar and the labor that have to be kind of tamed or put under control, where on the right kind of the labor is completely non-existent and the fashionably ordered oranges seems to be growing without any human intervention. Here in the same way, on the poster on the left, oranges in Jaffa, or Jaffa oranges, and on the right, a journey to Gibraltar. You see these both two different kinds of modes of transportation. On the left, a very orientalistic image of Palestine and kind of the background of Jaffa city and the camels carrying box crates of oranges. and we're on the right kind of a extremely militarized spot where the British were controlling the entrance to the Mediterranean, and kind of a family is taking a cruise ship to enjoy the Mediterranean warm weather.
Buy Empire every day, shouted posters to pedestrians in London. Although the British Empire had metastasized since the end of the 16th century, it was not until the 1920s that this whole propaganda machine became an institutional form of advertising. By 1933, the Empire Marketing Board had poster frames at 1,800 sites in 450 towns and cities in order to establish a sense of responsibility toward overseas residents of Empire, as well as to encourage the British public to become so-called responsible consumers at home. 40 million people had to be persuaded to change their habits and to choose Caribbean over Californian tinned fruit, for example. Racist, sexist, and culturally stereotypical, these depictions revealed to the British public the significance of their new role in civilizing, or so-called civilizing, modernizing, and developing the colonies. Responsibility for the economy was no longer just a matter for the government, but was transferred to citizens' consumption habits as well. So basically the idea was that if you don't buy and the national project collapses, it will also be your responsibility for not buying those particular products.
Empire shops were planned to open in London in the 1930s. Although none of them ever opened, they have made sultanas from Australia, oranges from Palestine, clothes from Zanzibar, and rum from Jamaica available and familiar in the British Isles.
So to track the contemporary legacy of those food infrastructures that were put in place by the British Empire back then, we decided to open the first Empire shop in London in 2016.
Instead of selling produce from Empire, the Empire Remains shop was a platform to speculate on the possibility and implications of selling the remains of the British Empire in London today. Over 3 months between the Brexit vote and Trump's election, it employed food as a tool to question current forms of power and dismantle geography's origin and abusive exchanges across the present and future of our post-colonial planet.
For the Empire Remains shop, the original vision of the never-opened Empire shops and their 5-part poster displays was also reinterpreted into its digital equivalent. This was the website that was kind of the aggregator for the whole project.
And we invited over 40 contributors to respond to the still present remains of empire power structures by drawing together performances, academic papers, dinners, trips, sonic nights, and culinary provocations. Each contribution responded to the implications of selling the remains of empire today. To overcome the limitations, of course, of duration and discipline, contributors operated through different agendas. Instead of working through geographies, we were interested in how the political, economic, social, spatial, or artistic agenda of each contribution could make new alliances, frictions, or conversations emerge.
After centuries of violent colonization, land dispossession, and appropriation of natural and cultural resources, the world still favors political structures that promote neoliberal nationalism. The Empire Remains shop traced the construction of landscapes, imaginaries, economies, and aesthetics derived from trading imperial foodstuffs in order to critically think of political country structures for a more evenly distributed, hyper-globalized world.
In that regard, the Empire Remains shop was used as a method to understand space in which power structures operate and explore how to use that as a field and opportunity to simultaneously challenge them.
And well, these are spreads from the book. Here you can see the table of contents that we can discuss later, the different pieces. But this was kind of one of the kind of departure points for the entire project, which is a recipe for the Empire Christmas pudding. And This recipe, in a way, is a gastronomic paradox because it's the most English of dishes made from the most un-English of ingredients. And it was written in 1928 by the King George V's chef André Sédar, and the dish is composed of 17 ingredients that come from 17 different places of origin.
Currants from Australia.
Sultanas from Australia or South Africa.
Stone raisins from Australia or South Africa.
Minced apple from United Kingdom or Canada.
Breadcrumbs from United Kingdom.
Beef suet from United Kingdom.
Cut candied peel from South Africa.
Flour from United Kingdom.
Demerara sugar from the British West Indies or British Guyana.
Eggs from United Kingdom or Irish Free State.
Ground cinnamon from India or Ceylon.
Ground cloves from Zanzibar.
Ground nutmeg from the British West Indies.
Pudding spice from India or British West Indies.
Brandy from Australia, South Africa, Cyprus or Palestine.
Rum from Jamaica or British Guyana.
Beer from England, Wales, Scotland or Ireland.
So 17 different ingredients that, more than a recipe, operate as a map.
The Empire Remains Christmas pudding traces the changes that have occurred in the post-colonial food market by exploring the economic strategies and forces that are at play today.
So currants, raisins and sultanas are today just packed in the UK.
The Empire Remains Christmas pudding makes evident that if once foodstuff promoted a specific origin, today majority of food products are rather packed in the UK or produced in the EU.
Brown sugar, for instance, is branded by Tate and Lyle as Guyanese inspired, as they say, instead of from Demerara. Guyanese sugar is included only when fluctuations in global pricing are convenient. At other times, Demerara inspired will suffice. In such cases, place is only important when it evokes a glorious landscape from the past, as happens in the marketing of Caribbean rum, with images of hedonism and lushness associated to it.
The Empire Remains Christmas pudding makes evident that if foodstuffs were once promoted according to their source, today food products are rather packed in the UK, milled in the UK, produced in the EU, or use sugar from a range of countries. New economies of origin do not promote a sense of place, but rather the erasure of it. The trusts consumers put in brands promotes a lack of transparency. But the dissolution of origins produces a contemporary logic that has shifted from made in to made nowhere.
Besides, wherever the soil could not produce at the lowest prices at a constant pace, or the earth itself had become exhausted, the overseas plantocracy at the periphery of empire has evolved into offshore financial centers. These centers do not trade in tangible commodities, but in ambiguous legality. And as Ronan Palland remarks, such activity in offshore jurisdictions happens in industries that should not have been there in the first place, as it does not make economic sense for the Cayman Islands to serve as the world's 5th largest financial center, for the Marshall Islands, Vanuatu or Liberia to be the international shipping giants, for small Pacific islands to be at the forefront of the telecommunications revolution, or for Guyana and Niue to be the central rerouting areas for internet porn.
A series of spaces in former colonies have emerged out of a financial extraction of value. No longer agricultural, but economy based on a place that does not need soil fertility to cultivate produce. Instead, they are places whose value depends on disconnected economy. These offshore economies are epitomized by buildings like this one, the Ogland House in the Cayman Islands, where almost 20,000 global firms are registered in the same address, all in this 4-story building.
Following these new spatial and economic structures that emerged from this imperial legacy, we kind of structured also the different components of this talk into different notions that disrupt the violent logic of perpetual circulation and accumulation of capital, but also other ways of thinking about financially built environments. Devaluing and degrowth.
In July 2013, lab technician Kenneth McRae murdered his wife Jane before killing himself in the West Midlands.
He went mad after finding out that Japanese knotweed was growing under his house.
It spread from the nearby golf course.
But no knotweed was found in the property after the fateful murder.
Last year, William Jones hanged himself after being notified that Japanese knotweed was growing on his lands.
Japanese knotweed, Fallopian japonica, and other non-native species have been at the forefront of a war against non-human invaders in Northern Europe and especially in the UK.
They have been accused of taking over lands,
Private property and public grounds,
gardens and forests,
houses and factories,
highways and waterways.
any ways in which a plant can appear.
Long before people started to take their own life into their hands, the British government allocated enormous sums of money to try and solve the problem.
The problem, plants from elsewhere invade us here.
In preparation of the 2012 Olympic Games, £100 million were spent clearing the Olympic grounds.
The total cost to the British taxpayer for fighting Japanese knotweed and other invaders is around £250 million per year.
It is estimated that the global expenditure on mitigation and eradication programs of invasive species has exceeded £1.8 trillion.
In the 2000s, Japanese knotweed was transformed from a horticultural problem into a media event. Journals, newspapers, and tabloids all reported the Great Invasion.
They portrayed the environmental challenge in war paint. They declared battle to save the pure British landscape.
The garden invader that could sink your mortgage.
The plant that ate Britain.
Not in my backyard.
At war with aliens.
Panic was not caused by the presence of Japanese knotweed. It was banks and credit institutions who made people panic. Any trace of knotweed on a property could result in the refusal of a mortgage.
Real estate market and property value are threatened by a plant, and a new industry of fear was born.
For the construction of the subjective taxonomies of native and non-native, pseudo-objective thresholds are to be demarcated. Any trace of knotweed on a property could result in a refusal of a mortgage. So the construction around the plant is dictated by how science and politicians determine the precise time when a plant arrives or when it becomes naturalized. The amount of years that a species has inhabited a certain place should be enough to determine its degree of belonging.
But what is the threshold?
3 years,
30 years?
300 years,
30,000 years?
or 300,000 years.
Over the past 2 centuries, the planet has experienced an incomparable movement of species across the globe. If we were to consider a longer time perspective, most native flora could actually be referred to as alien invaders. Not only the definition of native or non-native is challenging, but the association of the alien as a negative agent plays a crucial role in that distinction.
Japanese knotweed has been stigmatized as a non-native invasive or the plant that can sink your mortgage. There are 2 main reasons why it has created such an uproar in British media: being declared a non-native invasive plant and the fact that it can allegedly penetrate through the foundations of your house. However, there is no rigorous evidence of knotweed being more damaging than any other plant when it comes to growing through a crack on a concrete surface. Scaremongering deflation of property value and the refusal to grant mortgages to homeowners that have found knotweed in their premises are processes that have created this market for expensive eradication programs. And here you can see one of these forms to apply for a mortgage, and the surveyor in point 11 by law they have to prove whether there is or not the plant on the property. And you see the question, do you recommend the property as suitable security for a mortgage from the bank? The answer is no. Japanese knotweed was apparent within the rear garden, and in accordance with lender instructions, where this is found on or near the property, the case should be declined.
The next invasive is native rethinks the alien as an entity that actually constructs a new reality and brings a valuable hybridization. As part of it, we started a toxic assets portfolio, properties in the UK that have been devalued by Japanese knotweed, and houses that have witnessed a homicide or suicide because of the panic to the loss of value.
So at the Empire Remain shop here in our window, we also opened the Devaluing Property Real Estate Agency to explore what's the agency of a plant in devaluing property prices in a city like London. Hundreds of people stopped by and were curious about our toxic assets. Some engaged with the topic and others ridiculed it for playing with such a serious pillar of society.
After a half-hour consultation on how to devalue property through Japanese knotweed, customers were served the plant that can sink your mortgage, ice cream, a recipe that incorporates and embraces Japanese knotweed as part of a post-industrial city ecosystem, showing one of the many ways the prolific growth of the plant can be put into use, rather than fighting it through $1 million in pesticide programs.
Bankruptcy as success. Different from plantation houses being surrounded by the fields where value used to be harvested, the bungalow emerged as a building typology for capital flows, not from the immediate vicinity but from afar. The garden surrounding the bungalow had in time a hedge to demarcate the property of the landlord and remind local inhabitants that the space of the bungalow was the site also to manage exploitation. One of the plants that the British first introduced in India for the ornamental hedges around bungalow properties and displayed the power relations that separated the bungalow from the outside world was Lantana camara.
In less than a century, Lantana camara has become one of the greatest threats to wildlife and farming across India. Brought from America to Europe by the Dutch and then transferred to India by the East India Company, the plant serves as an ornamental hedge and butterfly attractor.
Current estimates suggest that Empire has spread the plant over more than 2 million hectares in South Africa, 5 million hectares in Australia, and as many as 30 million hectares in India. Various methods of controlling the plant were tried throughout the mid-20th century, including control with fire and mechanical removal, also biological and chemical control. However, it continued to spread despite human management.
In comparison to Australia and South Africa, where there is strict legislation on invasive species, local communities in India have adapted to the presence of lantana and started using it as a zero investment resource. For basketry, rubbish, bins, flower pot, fruit plates, or roof thatch, weaving hedges toys, it is even pulped to make paper.
On top of that, abusive environmental laws that aim to protect the forest from this invasion have not but displaced forest dwellers even further out for the sake of keeping the forests pristine.
In collaboration with Bangalore-based Forager Collective, we met with some of the members of the Soliga people, an indigenous group living in Hills, Karnataka, to learn about the way they have started using lantana to produce furniture as the only possibility for economic resistance. The Soligas had lost access to bamboo, their traditional building material, due to a series of so-called environmental protection laws that did not allow to use it as a forest resource. Lantana became the only raw material available they can legally access.
But contrary to the sturdiness of bamboo, lantana is quite pliable and allows for a whole different geometry and form. So what we did was to develop a prototype of a stool that actually incorporates the new properties of the material.
The Forest Does Not Employ Me Anymore is a series of lantana stools made by the Soligas, available on sale at the Empire Remains shop, at production price. The aim of the project is to publicize the socio-ecological struggle and persuade people and institutions to purchase the new lantana stools directly from the Soligas. Against the conventional logic of market growth, the ultimate aim of lantana business would be to exhaust all 13 million hectares of lantana across India. In other words, to run out of raw material and go bust. The success or best lantana business would sell enough lantana stools to bankrupt itself.
Commercial extinction. This was a project by artist duo Fraud, Frank Gallardo and Audrey Sampson, that took the brown shrimp as an object of inquiry to start understanding the relationships of species in an era of neoliberal age. Or what does it mean to die today in a neoliberal age? This is the brown shrimp, and they were looking at how for centuries it had been one of the sources of protein for people living along the riverbanks of the Thames in London, but also in other rivers around it. And it's a tiny little brown shrimp, the typical shrimp that you find in sandwiches, and the contradiction between the prices of the actual shrimp and the prices of the labor to peel the shrimp. So for decades the shrimp has been sent out to special economic zones in Tangier in Morocco, one of these facilities, to be peeled and then sent back to the UK for shrimp sandwiches.
So as peeling workers are being paid for the peeling of this tiny shrimp according to the amount of shrimps they peel by the hour, it is in many ways, you could say that the shrimp is ruled by the freedom of the seas. Freedom from labor regulations, freedom from environmental regulations, freedom from duty impositions, and freedom from international property rights. And in this project, Shrimping After Working Conditions, together with Fraud, we went on a series of shrimping expeditions at the Thames, basically explore how these labor conditions and relationships have been changing over time. Today, the fact that the cost of labor has become so expensive in Morocco and other places where the shrimp is being peeled basically made the fact that the shrimp didn't suffer from an ecological extinction but from a commercial extinction. It is basically not commercially viable anymore to peel shrimps that ensured the survival of this species in the Thames.
And after the shrimping trip, they organized a whole performative dinner, a shrimping or peeling dinner, where guests were forced to peel their own amount of shrimps, and basically it took some time until you would kind of create enough shrimps to eat like a slice of bread. And it was precisely to think or to weigh the amount of labor that you put onto the peeling of the shrimps and the idea of extinction or commercial extinction and the tensions between the two.
Lack of choice. So if you look at this building, one can wonder or be confronted with the fact that we don't find themselves many times anymore in contemporary days standing in front of a triangular building. And it's for us when the first time when we came across this building, we were quite staggered, but what happens inside? Are people walking up and down this pyramid? What is housed there? But actually, this pyramid is a storage house for sugar. And the way sugar or the moisture of sugar is measured is according to the angle at which it piles in when it's dropped from the top of this hanger. Basically, if a sugar that has 50%, a more moist sugar would pile up in a 50% angle, where a drier sugar would slope down to a 50% angle, and according to the parallel lines to the roof at 50 degrees, you can measure the moisture of the sugar itself.
So we were looking at these pyramids of the Caribbean precisely to understand the new tensions in the collapse of sugar landscapes in Barbados in particular, and after centuries of very violent labor and slavery, today the whole island and both the ecology and the economy of the island are going through serious transformation processes. This is one of the oldest maps of Barbados in the Caribbean, and here you can see all the sugar plantations and sugar mills along the coast, and how Barbados in a way became almost the economy was brought first, and then the population was brought afterwards in order to feed that brutal system of labor exploitation, but also to keep bodies, both on one side of the Atlantic and the other, kind of running on the kind of energy produced by sugar.
So, in order to kind of look into the transformation of the sugar landscape, we started noticing or learning about how the sugar industry in Barbados has been in great decline in the past decades due to various kind of new regulations in the EU, and also the fact that cheaper kind of other countries in the Far East were producing much cheaper sugar. And in order kind of to keep up or with this industry or to preserve it, today Barbados is trying to look at alternative means of what can be done with sugar. One of the things that they are thinking of investing in and have made series of plans is basically to transform one of these old sugar refineries into a bioethanol production plant.
But for us, the tensions come when you turn like the whole economy from one product to the other, or how to use sugar to either produce bioethanol or use sugar to produce rum. And these kind of very kind of, again, going back to the beginning of this rum from Caribbean imaginaries, choose one or the other. And what we produced was, today we are grain, which is a fountain that alternatively serves rum or bioethanol according to global macroeconomy, or basically according to the prices of oil in Nasdaq every day.
So basically every day or every period, once the oil price, whenever the oil prices are down, everyone rushes to buy oil. But whenever the prices of oil go up, the world is kind of searching for more sustainable and environmentally friendly alternatives to fossil fuels. And basically, according to that, every day, according to the fluctuation of oil prices on Nasdaq, we would serve either rum or bioethanol at the Empire main shop. And until the kind of morning of the opening, for instance, we didn't know whether we're going to have drinks at the Empire main shop or whether we're going to give people a small bottle of bioethanol to burn in their barbecue or kind of feed into their gas tank for their car.
And the other notion that we wanted to present is the idea of managing to use climatic seasons and the way in which the landscapes of extraction of fertilizers in a way contaminate also the new contemporary circulation of foodstuffs.
So in 1916, with the kind of end of the Ottoman Empire and the conquering of the Middle East by French and British counterparts, basically the Middle East was divided into two, between France in the north and Britain in the south.
And part of that was these, one of the many results of that appropriation of resources was fertilizers around the Dead Sea. Here you can see an image of the Palestine potash mine in the Dead Sea during British Mandate Palestine, and this is how the plant looks today. And the Dead Sea has become one of the top 7 sites of extraction of fertilizer, of potash, phosphates, and other substances that are extracted from the salts. And the consequence of that is these kind of landscapes around it, and how, as you can see here, the southern part of the Dead Sea, you might know, has been turned into a series of evaporation ponds to extract more and more fertilizers to feed the world. So the counter consequence of that is that the shorelines of the Dead Sea have been receding a meter a year.
And basically what has been happening because of that is a series of sinkholes emerging. So basically sinkholes, as you can see in these images, are a geological phenomena where basically in the Dead Sea you have these like big salt reserves underground, and as the sea is receding backwards, fresh water is seeping down into the earth and dissolving basically the rock salt formation, and then the earth that is on top of this rock salt basically cannot withstand anymore standing up in the air, and it just collapses into the ground. These sinkholes can range between 1 meter wide to half a meter deep. to up to 2 kilometers long and 25-meter deep, and they have been completely reshaping the whole kind of topography of the lowest place on Earth.
So it is not only about the appropriation of fertilizers or the kind of over-exhaustion of the soil, but also the circulation of water resources, and who is entitled to use them, or to, on the one hand, to evaporate the water, but also all the series of dams that have been built along the Jordan River in Lebanon, Syria, Israel, or what is it, Jordan. And on the other hand, also all the date palm plantations that are on occupied land, and the Israeli government is also irrigating with resources from the underground aquifer.
And against kind of all of this hyper-fertilization of the soil, we started questioning what are the consequences of the need to constantly being produce more and more food and make the soil kind of available to produce more and more agricultural products constantly all year round. And basically we started this project that we call Climavore, or basically trying to think how we eat according to new climatic seasons or climate change in an era of man-induced environmental transformations. So
one of the pieces, one of the first iterations of that kind of line of work for the shop was this series of dining surfaces that map these 6,000 sinkholes along the banks of the Dead Sea, and they are kind of floating or suspended in the air, but also they serve as a platform to have a series of meals around, or questioning basically what kind of alternatives we could think of to the over extraction of fertilizers or the hyperfertility of the soil. So the whole menu is constructed around seasons of or new climatic seasons, or new man-induced climatic seasons that try to follow another logic different from the traditional spring-summer or Eurocentric cycle of spring-summer, autumn and winter.
So basically, as we walk today into the supermarket and are constantly encountered by strawberries, asparagus, broccoli, etc., and this idea of kind of seasonal food is completely disappearing in the Western kind of context, or global North context. We really try to kind of think how new environmental phenomena can start shaping our diet. And during the research, while we were doing field work at the Cayman Island, we came across this fish called lionfish, which has been taking over the whole Caribbean Sea and basically eating through the whole aqua kind of population of fish and creatures that are smaller than him, and has really been creating a great economic threat to the diving industry, for instance, in the Cayman Islands. And in order to kind of deal with this problem, the Cayman Island government has started the whole program of tournaments to try and kind of control this great population of fish. And one of the moves they did is not only to create tournaments or incentives to people to fish them, but worked with a series of restaurants all over the island, basically to almost make this lionfish, which is very tasty, a national dish. So it's a fish that never existed in the Caribbean Sea and appeared there about 20 years ago and has been growing constantly in numbers. And basically working with restaurants all across the islands, they basically kind of try to see how would you kind of make a new cultural phenomena. And for us, this is what is very interesting about this, is that you would eat this kind of new cultural diet or kind of new cultural food product or recipe only through the duration where this is kind of an environmental challenge. So let's say in 20 or 30 years, once sharks learn to eat this fish and understand that it's not like just this like very weird thing they've never seen, and the ecology would rebalance itself, perhaps people in the Caribbean Sea or in the Cayman Islands will never eat another lionfish in their life. So this idea of basically a diet that has or a cultural heritage that has an expiration date, and how do we adapt our ways of eating to kind of different environmental transformations.
so that was in a way for us is still an ongoing project with Climavore, but basically to think of this flexibility towards these new man-induced climatic seasons instead of the traditional ways of understanding seasonality or that kind of cultural heritage. Some of the Empire Remains shop explorations, this idea of lack of choice or man-induced climatic seasons or dissolution of origin, in a way brought together different understandings and discussions around selling or counter-selling or other forms of circulation of both food produce but also capital flows.
The Empire Remains shop closed its doors in November 2016. The project was not about race, class, or gender inequalities analyzed as such, but rather seeks new counter-systems of power that learn from and appropriate corporatism. It goes against the perverse logic of shop for change and instead aims to propose a shift from consumerist activism to something that could be framed as counter-corporate activism. It uses the tools of neoliberalism to chip away at neoliberalism itself. Resources like speculation, trade, corporate social responsibility, franchising, and royalties can all become new tools to challenge existing logics of power and inequality.
Structured and bound by a franchise agreement for future iterations of the Empire Remains shop, the actual book is also an invitation for institutions, collectives, or individuals to construct their own counterpart, and with the aim to reflect on imperial legacies, but also the commodification of their own structures and infrastructure. Perhaps the first successful franchise in modern history resulted from the struggle of women to own businesses. And here you have visionary businesswoman Martha Matilda Harper that opened the Harper Hair Parlor in Rochester, New York in 1888. And by the early 1890s, she had opened branches first in Chicago and then across the US, creating a worldwide network of 500 hair salons at its peak.
Indebted to the French origin of the word franchise and its meaning to be free from servitude, Harper's model put low-income women in ownership roles after they completed her courses and training regime, managing their own shops under her guidance. It was not until the second half of the 20th century that franchises grew in popularity to become a symbol of the neoliberal system that unowns manufacturing, distributions, sale, and workers through dispersed, intricate legal and financial structures.
In this process, millions of people who produce, serve, sort, fold, clean, and toil for brands like Marks and Spencer, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Zara, Holiday Inn are serving the namelessness and the placelessness that characterize neoliberalism. For the millions of franchise employees across the world today, the disassociation from any mother company conceals whom they really work for, while allowing owners to spend money on branding and advertising rather than on working conditions.
Unlike many franchises that enforce standardization regardless of location, any franchise of the Empire Remains shop needs to be site-specific. At the heart of this model is the expectation for each franchise to differentiate itself through its response to local context and colonial histories.
The branding that is consistent across all franchises is not about trademarks, logos, or shelving techniques, but critical ideas, themes, and questions about the marks of trade that challenge disenfranchisement. In the same way that the Empire marketing boards, posters, recipes, and films served as a catalyst for a new visual language, identity, typography, and spatial design for colonial propaganda, the franchises must represent imperial legacies wherever the Empire Remains shop travels.
So in this invitation, basically, we've been kind of putting out this book and basically that is a compilation of various projects that happened in the shop, but also a manual of how kind of a shop could work in different contexts, in different sites all over the world, and really opening this to different collectives, individuals, or institutions that would like to pick up basically this platform or model and work with it in order to kind of understand how we can think about the future and the present of our post-colonial planet. And if anyone's interested, there are franchise agreements and books up at Robinson Crusoe, and it even is going today for a good price, we were told in the shop. So you're welcome to get yourself a copy and open franchise of the Empire Range Shop. Thank you.